Greetings, comrades, and welcome to How the Red Was Won, a podcast about organizing in the South, Texas fascism, and how to fight back. Today we are continuing our reading of R. Paul Dutt's Fascism and Social Revolution. I got about halfway through chapter 3 the last time, so we will be finishing chapter 3 today. Hopefully I can knock this out before I have to go to work. So just a reminder, this is being released to the Patreon as it gets recorded, and eventually it will also be released to the free feed as well as YouTube. So if you'd like to get these episodes sooner or all at once, please subscribe to the Patreon. I work 2 jobs, and this is just a little side project for me, so if it can sustain itself, whoo, that sure would be nice. So if you are able to help out, please find me on Patreon. Alright, let's just jump right into it as I move everything around. Chapter 3 is titled The New Economics and Politics, and we are on Section 3. Section 3 is titled The Revolt Against Science. The more and more conscious reactionary role of modern capitalism and the growing ideological revolt against the machine and sense of antagonism to the development of technique necessarily expresses itself on a wide front in the entire ideological field. A transformation in the dominant trends of capitalist ideology becomes more and more conspicuous. This transformation expresses itself in the growing revolt against science, against reason, against cultural development, against all the traditional philosophical liberal conceptions which were characteristic of ascendant capitalism. In favor of religion, idealistic illusions, denial of the validity of science, mysticism, spiritualism, multiplying forms of superstition, cults of the primitive, cults of violence, racial charlatry, parentheses, blood and Aryan nonsense, and all forms of obscurantism. Sounds a lot like what's happening right now, right? Rejecting science in favor of mystical, religious, non-science-based ideologies. Okay. This tendency was already visible from the outset of the imperialist epoch, and especially before the war. It has enormously increased in the post-war period. The relationship between science and the bourgeoisie has never, in fact, been an easy one. Only in the first revolutionary period of the bourgeoisie, in 17th century England or in later 18th century France, has there been real enthusiasm. In the 19th century, with the bourgeoisie in power, along the enormous profits to be won from the results of a science led to universal official recognition, laudations, and a somewhat stingy financial support, the suspicion was always present that the development of the scientific outlook might undermine the social foundations. Hence the gigantic battles of the 19th century over each advance of science. The leaders of 19th century bourgeois science were still warriors in the midst of widely hostile social camp. Education was still, in general, jealously guarded on pre-scientific lines and under clerical control. But what is conspicuous about the present period is that the offensive against science is today led no longer merely by the professional reactionaries and clericalists, but above all by the majority of the more prominent, officially recognized, and highly placed leaders of bourgeois science. The main bulk of the officially distinguished, benighted, and decorated scientists of the bourgeoisie have openly joined the clerical camp. They proclaim, with wearisome iteration, the reconciliation of science and religion, the overthrow for the 1000th time of the errors of materialism, the limitations of scientific knowledge, and the supremacy of the higher aspects of life which cannot be approached along scientific lines. In the spate of lectures, essays, treatises, and books whose popular vulgarizing and often grossly unscientific character betrays their propagandist aim, they endeavor to utilize each new advance of research and discovery not in order therefrom to reach a more scientific understanding of reality, but in order to throw doubt on the whole basis of science, and on this ground to proclaim the vindication of the particular tribal gods of their locality. This is funny to read today because the rapture is supposed to be happening. It didn't. I don't think it happened yesterday, but they gave it 48 hours. So maybe as I'm reading this, the true believers are floating away. Wouldn't that be nice for them? Okay. The utterances, still further vulgarized, are broadcast a millionfold by all the machinery of capitalist publicity as the last word of science. In this way, at the same time, as for technical and for strategical purposes, science has to be more and more widely employed in practice. A basically reactionary and even anti-scientific outlook is endeavored to be pumped into all the capitalist-controlled forms of popular culture. This transformation in outlook on the part of the responsible leaders of bourgeois science, with the honorable exceptions of a small and courageous minority, was recently illustrated in the treatment of the 50th anniversary of Darwin's death in 1932. This anniversary provided an opportunity for the entire forces of capitalist culture to proclaim either the complete obsolescence of the theories of the hated Darwin, or alternatively, the complete reconciliation of Darwinism with the religious conceptions which he fought, and the final refutation of the atheism to which he secretly, in Darwin's letter to Marx, adhered. The distinguished scientist and leading authority on Darwinism in England, Sir J.A. Thomson, wrote for general public consumption in the Daily Telegraph, April 19th, 1932, under the singular title, Darwin, 50 years after. We now accept evolution, yet believe in a creator. And the following is from that. There are some changes in our ideas since the hot-headed days that followed the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. Thus, many of us are clear that there is no inconsistency in accepting the evolution idea and yet believing in a creator who ordained the original order to nature in some very simple form. The evolution theory does not try to explain things in the deeper sense. Evolutionists leave to philosophy and religion all questions of purpose and meaning. This is a change for the better. Okay, so that was from that article. The shamefaced agnosticism of the 19th century scientists has given place in the 20th century to proclamation of a creator. This is an excellent example of the progress backwards of capitalism in decay. A further example of the transformation was afforded by an inquiry into the religion of scientists conducted by the Christian Evidence Society and published under this title in 1932. A questionnaire was sent to all fellows of the Royal Society. Replies were received from 200. The results on some of the principal questions showed the following proportions. 1. Do you credit the existence of a spiritual domain? Favorable, 121. Intermediate, 66. Unfavorable, 13. 2. Is belief in evolution compatible with belief in a creator? Favorable, 142. Intermediate, 52. Unfavorable, 6. 3. Does science negate the idea of a personal God as taught by Jesus Christ? Favorable to Christianity, 103. Intermediate, 71. Unfavorable, 26. Thus, omitting the intermediates, a spiritual domain, the expression as explained in the book as having been intended to mean the denial of materialism, wins by 9-1. God, a creator, wins by 23-1. Christianity wins by 4-1. These are the answers of the representative group of distinguished bourgeois scientists in 1932. We are not here concerned with the philosophical or theoretical significance of this transformation. What is important for present purposes is the social significance of the role of this development. The general fact of this avowed transformation of outlook of the majority of outstanding official representatives of bourgeois science and the loudly heralded movement against materialism and the limitations of science towards idealism and religion is familiar ground. How far this alleged movement of opinion is really true of the best bourgeois scientists or of the mass of younger working rank and file scientists is less important than the fact that the dominant official influences, both in the bourgeois scientific world and in general bourgeois discussion, actively support, foster, patronize, encourage, and in every possible way advertise and press forward this trend. What is not equally clear to all is the direct connection of this ideological trend with the whole process of capitalism in decay. It is at once its reflection and it helps to carry it forward. The revolt against science, which bourgeois society today encourages in the ideological sphere, at the same time as it utilizes science in practice, is not only the expression of a dying and doomed social class, it is an essential part of the campaign of reaction. This is the basis which helps to prepare the ground for all the quackeries and charlatanries and chauvinism, racial theories, anti-Semitism, Aryan grandmothers, mystic swastikas, divine missions, strongman saviors, and all the rest of the nonsense through which alone capitalism today can try to maintain its hold a little longer. So again, that sounds very familiar. I just finished listening to 6 parts Behind the Bastards on Heinrich Himmler, who was, he was a Nazi. We all know that. He was the head of the SS. And he was like one of the ones that was like the biggest into the weird like Norse mythology, thought he was descended from some Aryan god or whatever. Not all Nazis believe that, but it was pushed through the SS. And again, sounds a lot like what we're looking at today. All right. All this nonsense may appear in a cool view when some particularly wild evolution, Ebullition, particularly wild evolution of a Hitler or a Goebbels about blood and the joy of the dagger and the Germanic man and the primeval forest is produced. Like what I was just talking about, right? As highly irrational and even insane. But in fact, it is as completely rational and calculated for the present purposes of capitalism as a machine gun or a Zinoviev letter election. There is method in the madness, for capitalism can no longer present any rational defense, any progressive role, any ideal whatever to reach the masses of the population. Therefore, it can only endeavor to save itself on a wave of obscurantism, holding out fantastic symbols and painted substitutes for ideals in order to cover the reality of the universally hated money bags. Fascism is the final reduction of this process to a completely worked out technique. In unity with its revolt against science goes the general cultural reaction, the revolt against culture, the revolt against education, the cutting down of education in all capitalist countries, the increasing reactionary discipline and militarization in the universities and schools, the final and complete symbol of the culminating stage revealed by fascism, the burning of books. So, I stumbled a lot through that last paragraph, but basically what he's saying is this, like, revolt against science, revolt against the material, revolt against things that can be understood, and this turn towards mysticism, religion, fantasy even, is a sign of fascism. And, along with that, when the leaders start to believe these things, they start making it affect our education system. And we see that happening as well, right? Like, Texas just passed a law that says all public school classrooms have to have the 10 Commandments on display. Is that explicitly unconstitutional? Yes. Does it matter? No, it doesn't, because no one is gonna stop that from happening. So, That's just how it is now. I mean, people will stop it eventually, but we have to organize. The powers that be are not going to stop it. Okay, that was section 3. Section 4, the revolt against democracy and parliament. This economic, social, and ideological process finds also its political reflection. From the outset of the imperialist era, liberalism and parliamentarism, I cannot read today, parliamentarism has in fact been on the wane. Parliamentary democracy was essentially the form through which the rising bourgeoisie carried through its struggle against feudalism and against old privileged forms, carrying the working class in their wake in this struggle. On this basis was built up liberalism in its heyday in the 19th century. The workers were drawn in the tow of the bourgeois liberal politics. It was an achievement of Marxism to cut through this bondage. In Britain, where the capitalist world monopoly gave the bourgeoisie superior resources and the possibility to create a privileged section of a minority of workers, Marxism made the slowest progress, and liberal labor politics survived longest. As the class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie began to replace the old struggle against the bourgeois forms, a political shifting followed. The old liberal parties began to wane before social democracy. The bourgeoisie increasingly coalesced with the remnants of the older monarchist, militarist, land-owning forces. Nevertheless, parliamentary democracy remained as the most useful basis of the bourgeoisie for the deception of the masses and holding in of the class struggle, so long as this means of restraining workers was adequate. Today, when the intensification of the class struggle can no longer be held by these forms, the bourgeoisie increasingly turns its back on parliamentary democracy in favor of more direct and open forms of coercion and the authoritarian state. This is a measure of the weakening of the bourgeoisie. Again, we are looking at this happen right now. It's amazing that things that were written 100 years ago are so relevant. And by amazing, I think I mean sad and somewhat disappointing. Okay. The era of imperialism, of centralized monopoly capitalism, already increasingly made the parliamentary democratic forms a caricature. While in appearance the extension of the suffrage was increasing democracy, in reality the governing role was being directly removed from Parliament and concentrated in the executive, into the cabinet, and from the cabinet into the inner cabinet, and even into extra-parliamentary forms, Committee of Imperial Defense, etc., wholly removed from democracy. So the preparation of the War of 1914 compared the statement of the conservative Lord Hugh Cecil that the war was decided, quote, not by the House of Commons or by the electorate, but by the concurrence of ministers and ex-ministers, end quote. And that was a letter to the Times, April 1916. Again, we see this happening now, right? In the U.S., Congress are the only people who are able to declare war, but they haven't done that in a very long time. And we're still constantly at war with everybody. Or what we do now is fund proxies, right? We fund Israel so they can do the dirty work. We fund Ukraine so they can fight Russia. Find our ways around it, right? Corresponding to the realities of monopoly capitalism, the routine of government was in fact in the hands of an increasingly strengthened and centralized bureaucracy. Effective power and the decision of policy lay with the handful of leaders of finance capital. While the puppet show of Parliament, responsible ministers, elections, and nominally opposing parties became increasingly recognized as a decorative appendage of the Constitution for purposes of window dressing. This was equally conspicuous in the democracies of the United States, France, and Britain. So when George Jackson says that the U.S. has always been fascist, this is the shit he's talking about. On top of the obvious, treatment of the indigenous and the black people here, right? But this definition, Nevertheless, liberalism enjoyed one last blooming in the earlier or pre-war period of imperialism. but in the new form of liberal imperialism with its deceptive program of social reform, the super profits of imperialism provided the means in the imperialist countries to endeavor to buy off the revolt of the advancing workers with a show of meager concessions to a minority. This is what we mean when we say that even though Americans are struggling, right, our life in the imperial core is propped up by the imperialism, right, by the oppression of workers, specifically in places like the Congo and like in South America, where they grow a lot of food. Congo is, for the mining and the resources. And so those people are extra oppressed. So that even though the working class here is struggling and has it pretty bad, we have our little treats. We still get our little treats. We get our burgers. We get our plastic trinkets and bullshit, because our country is an imperialist nation. Okay. Bismarck had already shown the way to utilize social reform legislation alongside coercion in order to endeavor to stem the advance of socialism. On the basis of imperialist exploitation was built up the short-lived 20th century renaissance of social reform liberalism with the Lord George era, which tried to stem the rising tide of working-class revolt with a loudly advertised show of concessions and concern for the condition of the people, and with noisy campaigns of denunciation of the landlords and the aristocracy, while the real aims of imperialism and war preparation were pressed forward, and all the forces of the state were employed against the militant working class struggle, right? The Social Democratic and Labor parties after the war tried to carry forward the role of social reform liberal imperialism, but under basically changed conditions. In a far more advanced stage of the class struggle, and in the midst of the crisis and decline of capitalism, therefore, they could not attain any corresponding measure of success. The appeal they could make to the masses on behalf of parliamentary reformism no longer evoked enthusiasm. The reforms they could achieve were limited by the economic crisis, the weakening national finances, and the weight of the war debts they had to carry. The repressive and coercive measures they had to exercise against the class struggle were far heavier. At least they have to work to keep us down, right? But even the limited measure of social reform concessions began to break down and dwindle under the pressure of the economic crisis. With the rising colonial revolts, the basis of imperialism began to weaken. The stream of super profits diminished. The conflict of rival monopolist capitalisms became more intense. Thus, a reverse moment set in, no longer to the extension of social concessions, but on the contrary, to the cutting down and withdrawal of concessions already granted. This process received its powerful demonstration in the history and the fall of the Second Labor Government in the crisis of 1931. So, even though we have some little treats, some little rights, they're going to start taking those away. And again, we see that now, right? I live in a state with a full abortion ban. So concessions that we were given, 50 years ago when maybe the economy was better, post-war period, they're now coming back and taking them away. They're going to do it to gay marriage. They're doing it to our education system, like cutting funding to that. All of that. It's fun. It's great. From this point, the class struggle is forced increasingly into the open, bursting through the thin cover of liberal and parliamentary democratic illusions. Even social democracy is forced to speak of the collapse of reformism and the end of social reform and the consequent inevitability of a frontal attack on capital. So the general propaganda line of the, I don't know this word, Leicester, I assume that's a town, Labor Party conference in 1932. At the same time, it merges in practice still more completely into alliance with monopoly capitalism and repression of the workers. The confrontation of the working class and capitalism could no longer be covered by liberal and reformist pretenses of improving conditions under capitalism. So basically, like, shit is so bad, we're watching it collapse, these reforms be taken away, we can no longer, or they can no longer, like, hide by giving us treats. From this point, the demand becomes increasingly strong from the representatives of capitalism for throwing aside or modification of the old parliamentary democratic forms, which no longer serve their purpose, and the establishment of open and strengthened forms of repression and dictatorship. The revolt against democracy and parliament, which was already marked in bourgeois circles before the war, but was still confident in direct expression to narrower reactionary circles, now become general in all current expression. The demand of an Owen Young for a holiday of parliaments, and here's a quote, "If a holiday of armaments is good, a holiday of parliaments would be better." Kind of silly. Or a Sir William Beveridge, a world dictator, something he was advocating for, or the announcement of a Gordon Selfridge to the American Chamber of Commerce in London on his return from the United States that, quote, "As an American, he spoke to 50 representative men in America and did not find one who disagreed with his view that democracy in a great country could not possibly succeed as a system of government. A country should be managed as a great business was managed." Yikes. That's an end quote. Times, June 1932. Trump's first run, people were like, let's run the country like a business. Right? It's wild how we're just like in this cycle. Okay. These and 1,000 similar expressions are typical of the present outlook of the representatives of finance capital and are paralleled by a skeptical tone of the parliamentarians themselves. The openly anti-parliamentary tone of the press, or of the once progressive literary intelligentsia, no less than the direct attack of a Churchill, Lloyd, or Tardo. So, not only are the business leaders saying this, but the parliamentarians themselves are like, yeah, government's dumb. Let's run like a business. Very cool. Very cool. The Social Democratic and Labor parties, moving parallel with capitalism, undergo a similar transformation of outlook and begin to speak increasingly of the limitations of Parliament and the necessity of strengthening discipline and authority in the state. Neo-socialism in France, the Socialist League propaganda in England, etc., etc. The practice of modern capitalism moves increasingly away from parliamentary democratic forms to strengthened and more open coercion of class dictatorship. This applies not only to the directly fascist states, but also to the diminishing number of imperialist states which remain nominally democratic. The Roosevelt emergency powers and the national government in Britain represent stages and phases of a process of transformation, corresponding in some respects to the Brüning stage in Germany. Modern legislation increases the powers of the executive, of the bureaucracy, and of the police, and more restricts the limits of the legal working class movement, of the right of meeting and association, and the right to strike. This process of the transformation of democracy in the Western imperialist countries and preparation of the ground for fascism is further explained in a later chapter. The stream against parliamentary democracy is rising on all sides, although this does not mean that capitalism has yet exhausted its uses. But the real issue is commonly confused by the vulgar propagandist treatment, and the attack on democracy is a parallel attack of communism and fascism. On the contrary, the critique of communism or Marxism against capitalist democracy is not that it is too democratic, but that it is not democratic enough. That it is in reality only a deceitful cover for capitalist dictatorship, and that real democracy for the workers can only be achieved when the proletarian dictatorship breaks the power of the capitalist class. The movement of modern capitalism, on the other hand, against the parliamentary democracy, is a movement to strengthen repression of the working class and establish an open and violent dictatorship of monopoly capital. The reality of this issue between oligarchic dictatorship and working class freedom breaks through the old illusory trappings of parliamentary democracy. So what he's saying here is that liberals say, look at this, communists attack our democracy and so do fascists, they're the same. That's like where this horseshoe theory bullshit comes from. But what he's saying here is that the reason that communists dislike liberal democracy is because it's not democratic enough, right? It is an oligarchy, it's for the rich. The working class doesn't have any power in a liberal democracy. And that the fascists want even less for the workers, right? They want to absolutely crush any ability to strike or for workers to advocate for themselves. All right. That was section 4. Section 5, national self-sufficiency. A no less strongly marked expression of the modern tendencies of capitalism is the movement towards so-called national self-sufficiency, autocracy, national planning, isolationism, etc. This is essentially America first, right? This tendency has come most strongly to the front since the world economic crisis and the breakdown of the World Economic Conference revealed its strength. This development is the logical working out of imperialist decay. Of this tendency, as the dominant tendency in the latest phase of world politics, the League of Nations economic expert Sir Arthur Salter wrote in his standard work Recovery in 1931, and here is a long quote. World trade may be restricted to small dimensions through every country, excluding imports of everything which, at whatever expense, it can make or produce at home. Along this line of development, America might withdraw herself, arresting and almost abandoning her foreign investments, sacrificing her export trade, and cultivating an isolated self-sufficiency on the lower level of prosperity, which this would necessitate. As the world closed against her, Great Britain might be forced to supplement such a preferential trade with the dominions in India as may be practicable, with a policy of exploiting and closing in her non-self-governing empire from the rest of the world, against all the traditions and principles of her history. This line of development would mean loss to every country, impoverishment to countries like Switzerland, which have no similar resources, and an organization of the world into separate units and groups, which would soon be dangerous and ultimately fatal to world peace. It is along this path that the world is now proceeding. So, isolationism is what he's talking about. This description, although faithfully reflecting one side of the tendency, and to some extent indicating the possible outcome, is not a fully correct description of the actual process. For, while the propaganda speaks in terms of internal self-sufficiency, the reality of the policy remains the fight of the imperialist powers on the basis of this strengthened internal organization for the world market. In fact, the movement towards closed monopolist arena is not in itself new, but is inherent in the whole development of imperialism, whose essential character is the denial and ending of free trade. What is new is only the extreme intensity with which this monopolist policy is now pursued, and the complexity of the weapons which are now brought into play for its realization. Not only the old tariff weapons, which are now brought to unheard of heights, again, same as it ever was, but a host of new weapons, surtaxes, variable, at a moment's notice, quotas, embargoes, exchange restrictions, currency control, complex trade alliances, state subsidies, and direct state economic control are now brought into play by the imperialist giants in their ever more desperate conflict for closed markets, for privileged areas of exploitation, and for control of the sources of raw materials. The intensified conflict of the imperialist powers for the shrinking world market makes this development to new and ever fiercer weapons of economic warfare, and essentially reactionary choking of the channels of free world trade, not merely some foolish and mistaken policy of particular statesmen, but the inevitable development of working out of the inner laws of imperialism. In vain, the theoretical economic experts of the League of Nations throw up their hands in distress and deplore the universal loss and impoverishment caused by such politics. In vain, the international conferences of economic experts as Geneva in 1927 passed unanimous resolutions condemning the destructive barbarism of such intensified economic warfare, calling for its reversal. The reality moves in its opposite direction to the resolutions. For there is no world capitalism as a whole to adopt the enlightened policies so patiently and incessantly held out by economic theorists and would-be reformers of capitalism. Just here is the cardinal error of the Salters and their company. There is only the conflict of the rival imperialist powers. And in the conditions of this conflict, the statesmen and leaders of finance capital, however much they may regret the cost and losses involved, see no alternative to the policies they find themselves compelled to pursue if they are not to go under. In the words of the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, on the eve of the World Economic Conference, explaining the necessity of maintaining economic warfare, quote, much as all of us regretted the economic warfare which had arisen between us and other countries, we must maintain that warfare as long as it was the other countries which had taken the aggressive, end quote. That is Neville Chamberlain in the House of Commons in June 1933. We must attain that warfare. The fault lies with the other countries. This, the keynote of all the imperialist powers. The most important expression of this transformation of policy in the present period was the passing of British imperialism in 1932 from the old free trade basis to a general tariff and the policy of closed empire. The long survival of free trade in Britain reflected the remnants of the old commercial and financial world domination. The Chamberlain propaganda in the beginning of the imperialist era and the strongly reinforced empire economic unity propaganda after the war showed the pressing forward of the new forces. As late as 1926, the Bankers' Manifesto, issued in that year, still called for a general movement towards lower tariffs and free trade. The Bankers' Manifesto of 1930, signed by all the most important financial leaders, marked the decisive turn and the end of the last remains of the old era, with its declaration, quote, the immediate step for securing and extending the market for British goods lies in reciprocal trade agreements between the nations constituting the British Empire. As a condition for securing these arrangements, Great Britain must retain her open market for all empire products while being prepared to impose duties on all imports from all other countries, end quote. We're talking trade war here, right? The Ottawa Conference of 1932 showed the attempt to carry out this policy. Although, in relation to the Dominions, heavy concessions from Britain have won only small and doubtful gains, in relation to India and the Crown colonies, the policy is being pressed forward at full strength. The subsequent elaborate trading negotiations for exclusive agreements, the agricultural quota arrangements, and the use of the currency weapon to endeavor to organize a sterling bloc all mark the development of a new system. Attempts are frequently made to present the new phase of intensified monopolist conflict in idealist form under cover of the slogans national planning, national self-sufficiency, etc., or to compare it with the entirely opposite process of socialist construction of the Soviet five-year plan. The manifest economic breakdown of the capitalist anarchy, contrasted with the simultaneous gigantic advance of the Soviet five-year plan, led to an outburst of talk of planning in the capitalist world. A World Planning Congress was held in Amsterdam in 1931. A myriad abortive schemes for 5-year plans, 10-year plans, and 20-year plans were put forward in all the capitalist countries. The Trades Union Congress of 1931, true to its line of alliance with capitalism and worship of organized capitalism, adopted a resolution which declared, quote, this Congress welcomes the present tendency towards a planned and regulated economy in our national life, end quote. That was 1931. Needless to say, this description of the real process which is taking place is a complete deception. The conditions of private ownership of the means of production and of production for profit negate the elementary conditions for any real scientific economic planning, which requires a single ownership of the means of production and the organization of production for use. The reality, which is described under the euphemism for a planned and regulated economy in our national life, is intensified monopolist organization in a given imperialist area for the purpose of sharpened world imperialist conflict and increased exploitation of the workers, right? So the 5-year plans work. The Soviets did it. China comes out with these. That's what a planned economy is, right? So when you are looking at your population and what it needs, and because it's a centralized government, a centralized workers' government, can decide, look at trends, look at growing population, and plan for this so that people have what they need, right? It doesn't work when your goal is profit, because your companies plan, right? Companies have 5-year plans, but the goal is profit. The goal isn't feeding people. It's frustrating. Okay. Here we are. The complete passing over of the previous progressive elements in capitalism to the new reactionary policies is illustrated by the conversation of the former leading liberal economic theorist Keynes in his articles on national self-sufficiency. This was in July 1933, and quote, "I was brought up, like most Englishmen, to respect free trade, not only as an economic doctrine, which a rational and instructed person could no doubt, but almost as part of the moral law. I regarded departures from it as being at the same time an imbecility and an outrage. I thought England's unshakable free trade convictions, maintained for nearly 100 years, to be both the explanation before man and the justification before heaven for her economic supremacy. As lately as 1923, I was writing that free trade was based on fundamental truths, which stated with their due qualifications, no one can dispute who is capable of understanding the meaning of words. Looking again today at the statements of these fundamental truths which I then gave, I do not find myself disputing them. Yet the orientation of my mind is changed, and I share this change of mind with many others." End quote. He then sets out the drawbacks of which he has become aware in the working out of a system of international capitalism, and reaches the conclusion, quote, "I sympathize, therefore, with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglements between nations. I am inclined to the belief that after the transaction is accomplished, the greater measure of national self-sufficiency and economic isolation between countries that existed in 1914 may tend to serve the cause of peace rather than otherwise." End quote. More fully, he declares, again, quote, "We wish to be as free as we can make ourselves from the interferences of the outside world. Ideas, knowledge, art, hospitality, travel. These are things which should of their nature be international. But let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national." End quote. It will be seen that the outlook of Keynes has begun to approximate that of Hitler. This is a valuable measure of capitalism in decay. The reality behind the phraseology of a Keynes or other capitalist national planners must not be misunderstood. The belated discovery by Keynes of the naive, subjective, and uncritical assumptions on which the old traditional economic science of the bourgeoisie, especially in its center in England, was always based, does not here concern us. Marx, long ago, in the middle 19th century, before, not after the event, laid bare the local, temporary, and insular character of the free trade economic theory as only the reflection of the historically caused British capitalist supremacy, and showed also how this phase would necessarily pass, how British capitalist supremacy would disappear, and with it the accompanying free trade theory, and liberal free trade capitalism would pass into monopolist capitalism in the period of decay. However, The empiricists can only learn from the behind side of history. Only the impact of the event compels the bourgeois professors of economics to begin to grope for the source of their errors. Keynes, the faithful believer in the divine ordinance of free trade and British economic supremacy until 1923, in 1933 announces his disillusionment of the pride of a pioneer. What is important, however, is that this disillusionment or change of mind, which he shares with many others, is only the reflection of the change of capitalism, which he translates into universal conclusions in exactly the same subjective and uncritical way as the old free trade theory, which he now condemns. For in fact, the issue is no longer between international free trade capitalism and monopolist capitalism in its modern times. That issue has long been settled in practice. At the present time, history has placed on the order of the day a different issue, of which he is aware. The daring advance which he believes himself to have made in this thought, which his conversion from old liberal fetishes to national self-sufficiency leaves him in reality still well in the rear of events as a faithful servitor of the ruling class. He has simply passed from being the servitor of one phase of capitalism to be the servitor of the next. In reality, national self-sufficiency is only the ideal cover for the modern forms of monopolist capitalism, extreme intensification of the antagonisms, and advance to fascism and war. Just as the imperialist blocs cover their predatory wars for the spoils of the world under cover of the slogan of national defense, so they seek increasingly today to cover their monopolist economic organization and warfare under the cover of the slogan of national self-sufficiency. It is this advance to war which is the essential significance concealed behind the slogan of national self-sufficiency. All right, that's section 5. So basically, this economic warfare, right? This change from free trade capitalism while these empires were expanding to now closing off, putting in tariffs and duties and whatever you want to call them, taxes essentially on trade, making it harder for countries that have less arable land or whatever it is to trade, right? And it's part of that Britain first, America first, Germany first, whatever, closing off yourself from the rest of the world. Section 6. So all of this was leading, right, to section 6, titled War as the Final Solution. Here we go. The culmination and final working out of all the new policies of capitalism under the stress of the world crisis is the advance to the Second World War. The effects of the world economic crisis enormously intensified all existing international antagonisms. The Pacific internationalist language of the stabilization period, which is like the Kellogg Pact, gives place to increasingly open national chauvinist language and policies. International conference after international conference breaks down. Even such limited success as attends the measures of the internal reorganization, of strengthening and tightening up of monopolist economy and aggressive power within each imperialism only leads to the intensification of world antagonisms. Right, so tightening up your monopolist economy is just gonna worry everybody else around you. There is a renewed and ever more feverish pressing forward of armaments on all sides, and of industries connected with armaments. The World Disarmament Conference breaks down. Japan and Germany withdraw from the League of Nations. The issue of disarmament passes into the issue of rearmament. Alliances and counter-alliances are actively built up on every side. The Naval Limitation Treaty passes into the melting pot. Alongside the limited revival of world production in 1933 and 34, and indeed, as an important element in this revival, the armaments industries leapt forward. Their shares and profits rapidly rose. According to the calculations of the German Institute of Economic Research, the proportions of world armaments expenditure and of world production on the basis of 1928 as 100 showed the following significant picture. So we're looking at years 1913, 29, 30, and 32. And we're looking at, let's see, expenditure and world production. Anyway, it's increasing. I'm not going to read all these numbers, but basically we're talking about building more weapons, right? Again, things that happen right now. The world budgets of the principal countries for 1934 showed a sharp net increase. Germany by 17 million, of the United States by 16 million, of France by 10 millions, and those with some loans as well. Japan by 9 million, Britain by 5 million. This is written in pounds, but it doesn't really, the numbers don't matter. Showing an increase, right? Like, people are making more bombs. The gathering expectation of the close approach for war finds increasingly frequent expression in the speeches of the statesmen to all countries. Typical was Mussolini's "War Today" declaration in his speech to the officers of the Italian army maneuvers in August 1934. This is a quote from Mussolini. "War is in the air and might break out at any moment. We must prepare, not for a war for tomorrow, but for a war of today." End quote. In July 1934, Marshal Pétain declared in his speech to the Reserve Officers' Conference at St. Malo that the next war would break out like a lightning flash. Baldwin, in advocating the new British air program in the House of Commons in July 1934, reported, quote, "A greater sense of uneasiness, of malaise, in Europe than we have hitherto experienced," end quote. Churchill, in the same debate, declared, quote, "The situation is serious and grave. Europe was moving ever more rapidly into a tightly drawn net. Almost all nations were arming, and everyone felt that the danger they dreaded most of all was drawing nearer." End quote. The propaganda war spreads. War begins to be presented as the heroic alternative, the last hope, the way out from the unending nightmare of economic crisis, misery, and unemployment. Fascism, the most complete expression of modern capitalism, glorifies war. The filthy sophism, "war means work," begins to be circulated by the poison agencies of imperialism and filters down to the masses. As Carlyle, in whom many attendants of fascism can be traced, wrote in his Sartor Resartus, this is, quote, "The lower people everywhere desire war. Not so unwisely. There is then a demand for lower people to be shot," end quote. Jesus Christ. That was worse than I remember it. Oh, okay. The lower people. Wow. It is a measure of the stage reached by capitalist civilization that today, before the leading capitalist countries other than Japan are yet directly involved in war. While there are still nominally conditions of peace, it is possible for such an argument to be seriously presented and widely repeated and actually discussed that murder is the only way to provide men and women with work and livelihood. That's dark. Okay. All today see the ever more visible approach of war. Rising alarm is expressed in many quarters of bourgeois opinion, who see the ruin and destruction of the entire existing society evolved in the menace of renewed world war. But these sections of anti-war opinion see only the question of war in isolation and concentrate their efforts on capitalist machinery to avoid war, without realizing that such machinery of imperialism can only function as machinery to organize the future war in the name of ideal symbols. Bourgeois pacifism, attached to the League of Nations and preaching passivity and non-resistance to the masses, becomes an indisputable part of the war preparations of imperialism, and as such officially recognized and encouraged by all the war-making statesmen of imperialism. All the statesmen of imperialism, Roosevelt, MacDonald, Henderson, and Paul Boncourt, Mussolini, and Hitler, are today pacifists in their public utterances and in their governmental roles, actively pressing forward the building of armaments and the preparation of imperialist war. War is the only continuation and working out of the crisis of capitalism and of the present policies of capitalism. It is inseparable from these and cannot be treated in isolation. All the policies of capitalist reorganization, all the policies of fascism can only hasten the advance to war. This is equally true of the line of a Roosevelt, a MacDonald, or a Hitler. War is no sudden eruption of a new factor from outside, a vaguely future menace to be exercised by special machinery, but is already, in essence, implicit in the existing factors, in the existing driving forces and policies of capitalism. All the existing policies of capitalism are policies of ever-sharpening war, of ever more formidably organized imperialist blocs, of tariff war, of gold war, of currency war, of war with every possible economic, diplomatic, and political weapon. It is no far step from these to the final stage of armed war. All the existing policies of capitalism are more and more dominantly policies of destruction. The capitalists are, today, the destructive force in human society. All their most typical modern policy, from super tariffs and debt enslavement of whole states to burning foodstuffs and devastating cotton plantations, from dismantling plant and machinery to throwing millions of skilled and able workers into the scrap heap of starvation, is a policy of destruction of human effort and labor, strangling of production, destruction of life. War is only a continuation of this policy. It is no far step from spending millions of pounds to buy up machinery in order to destroy it, to spending millions to produce guns and warships and munitions to be blown up in the air. It is no far step from condemning millions of human beings to the death in life of unemployment as superfluous to the final solution of disposing of their lives and bodies by bomb and gas and chemical for the greater profit of whatever group of capitalists can gain most in the redivision of the world by the Holocaust. But this does not mean that war, any more than fascism, presents the final solution to the crisis of capitalism. On the contrary, war, like fascism, is today the outcome of the intensified contradictions of capitalist society in decay. But neither solve those contradictions. On the contrary, both bring out these contradictions to the most extreme point, organize upon their basis, and lay bare the deep disintegration of existing society, both internally and internationally, to the point of destruction. The crisis extends and develops through these forms to yet greater intensity, and thereby only reveals the more sharply that the sole final solution lies in social revolution. Ooh, I like the way that chapter ends. That is powerful. So basically, the whole chapter is explaining all of the different contradictions, the things that are arising underneath bourgeois capitalism, right? The destruction of productive forces. What are they all? Destruction of productive forces, the revolt against the machine, and then the revolt against science, and then the revolt against democracy, the national self-sufficiency, and then the last one is war is the final solution, right? So all of these contradictions that are inherent in bourgeois capitalism, in bourgeois liberalism, bourgeois democracy, are all coming to a head and leading towards this, like, international war is a final solution, which we know is what happens. But he's saying that it doesn't have to be that way, right? That even though that is what happened and that is obviously where this was heading, that let's say if the UK or France or Germany really had a socialist revolution instead of a world war, it would have been better for everybody, right? And so now when we compare the things that were happening then to the things that are happening now, I think that we have the same options ahead of us, right? The only capitalism leads to fascism, right? It leads to monopoly capitalism. That's hard to say a million times. Monopoly capitalism. And then that leads to fascism. But the only way to stop that is a socialist revolution. So I, again, am of the school of thought that the US is and has always been fascist. It ebbs and flows. It looks differently in different communities of people, but the US, if not has always been here, has always been headed here, right? And so, once again, we are faced with making a choice. And unless we want full, open barbarism, the only way out of this is socialist revolution, which is probably scary to some people, but I think that's actually really hopeful, and that it should give us hope, and that knowing that it doesn't have to be terrible, we don't have to live under open fascism. We can change it. We have that power as the working class. We just have to, well, understand that first, right? And then, do the damn thing, organize. So I don't know. I hope that leaves you feeling hopeful. That last couple of paragraphs is really powerful. I know it was kind of a slog to get here, but the book really is great from here on out. So thank you for sticking with it. I appreciate you all. Thank you for listening. Cheers.